Grandmaster Boleslavsky is known for his contributions to the development of King's Indian defense. And alongside with David Bronstein and Yefim Geller, he is a very important player for anyone who wants to get a better understanding of the King's Indian defense and its main ideas. In this game, using his opponent's unnatural, inaccurate move, he sacrificed a pawn in the opening and got a very strong initiative and attack on white king. So let's see how this happened. So c4, knight f6, it's King's Indian defense, d4, castle, c4, d6, bishop e2, e5, d5. And here the most natural and common move is knight d7, developing the knight, and white now can either play bishop g5, it would be a Petrosian variation, pinning the knight, or just castle, and after knight c5 attacking e4, queen c2 defending it, and now a5 taking under control the b4 square in order to prevent b4, which would push away the knight. However, Boleslavsky made an uncommon move. He played knight h5 immediately. So this is a typical maneuver in the King's Indian defense. The idea is to unblock the f-pawn in order to move it, and also the knight can jump to f4. Here the most natural move would be g3 in order to take under control the f4 square. However, Boleslavsky's opponent, after knight h5, made an unnatural move, knight g1. It's unnatural because the knight goes back onto its initial square, and it's bad for the development. The idea of this move is to attack the h5 knight with a queen-bishop battery and threaten to win a pawn. And now the most natural for Boleslavsky would be just to play knight f4, attacking the pawn and the bishop, and bishop would go to f1, defending g2, and later white would play g3, pushing away the knight, then fianchet to the bishop, putting it on g2, and so on. And it would be a typical King's Indian struggle with a more or less equal position. However, after knight g1, Boleslavsky, instead of the natural knight f4, found a more interesting idea. In using the unnatural knight g1 move, he wanted to punish his opponent with a more active play. So I offer you to pause the video and try to find Boleslavsky's idea. So Boleslavsky decided to sacrifice a pawn and just continued his development, knight d7. His opponent, Sabo, accepted the sacrifice, took on h5 twice, and now knight c5. So the idea of the sacrifice is that black gets initiative now. First of all, the g file is open because there is no g6 pawn anymore, and after white castles, black would be able to exert pressure on g file. Besides that, the queen is placed not so good on h5, and it would become a target for black pieces soon. And black will constantly create threats to trap this queen, as you will see. At the moment, also after the exchange of the bishop, light square bishop on h5, light squares are weakened now. And knight, for example, can jump to d3, checking the king. At the moment, b4 is bad for this reason, because it would be followed by knight d3 check, and then knight would take the pawn. And white played knight f3. Now the most natural move, natural looking move, which is knight d3 check, taking away the right of castling from white, isn't very good, because white would just play king e2, And after knight takes, rook takes f5, knight g5, creating checkmate threats on h7, h6, knight e6, white is better. That's why after knight f3, Boleslavsky didn't check on d3 and played f5, active play. Of course, it would be bad now for white to take on e5, because after rook takes f5, there are no comfortable squares for the queen to retreat, because the only squares are g4 and h3, and on both of these squares there would be a very unpleasant x-ray. So that's why after f5, white didn't take and just castled. And black played f4. Instead of f4, f takes e doesn't make sense, because white would just play knight g5, threatening checkmate, and after bishop f5, defending h7, white would just play queen e2 and take on e4 next move, and white is a pawn up, and black doesn't have a serious compensation. That's why Boleslavsky played f4. And now you can clearly see what he got for the sacrificed pawn. First of all, as I already said, pressure on g-file. Besides that, the bishop on c8 is very strong. After f5, it has open diagonal, and after king h8, for example, and rook g8, the bishop and rook would create serious threats. Bishop, for example, would threat to go to h3 and create threats on g2. Besides that, f4 pawn is very strong. As you see, black got space advantage on the king side, and f4 pawn in particular is very exerting pressure on g3, e3, limiting white pieces. Bishop, for example, dark square bishop is very bad. It has no prospects on this diagonal. And which is also very important, the queen on h5 is placed very badly, and black would constantly threaten to trap it, as you will see. So all this Boleslavsky got just for one pawn. So now white played b4, pushing away the active knight, knight d7, bishop b2, as the bishop doesn't have any prospects on this diagonal. Queen e7, knight g5, threatening checkmate on h7, knight f6, defending h7 and also attacking the queen. Now if queen goes to d1, for example, it would be followed by knight g4, attacking the knight. And now if knight goes to e6, black would just take, d takes, and play queen h4. This is absolutely winning for black already, because black is threatening checkmate. The only defense is that makes sense is h3. However, it would be followed by f3, destroying the king side, and white cannot take the knight because it would be followed by queen takes g4, threatening checkmate, and if g3, then queen h3, again checkmate threats. That's why after knight f6, white just played queen h4. However, on this square, queen also has serious problems, as you will see. It has no easy ways to retreat and leave the king side, where it becomes a target for black pieces. So black played h6, attacking the knight. Now if knight e6, black would just take, so take back, get back the pawn, keeping all the positional advantages. For example, knight d5, attacking c7, rook f7, defending it, knight takes, rook takes. Now the white pawn is under attack, so rook c1, for example, and f3, destroying the king side, so this position is much better, if not winning, for black. That's why after h6, white played knight f3. And now a very strong move, queen f7. At the moment you see the knight is pinned, That's why Boleslavsky played queen f7, unpinning the knight, and also taking under control the h5 square. Now black is threatening to trap the queen in two moves, playing knight h5 and bishop f6, attacking the queen, and queen doesn't have any squares to retreat. That's why, in order to retreat, white played knight d2 in order to play f3, and so that queen can retreat on this diagonal. And Boleslavsky knew that f3 is coming, because that's the only way to avoid the loss of queen. And he saw that after f3, the e3 square would be weakened, and the knight, black knight, would be placed there perfectly. That's why he played knight g4. Now bishop f6 is a threat, that's why f3, and knight e3. Knight e3 is very strong. It came here with a tempo, attacking the rook. And also it is attacking g2, and after black puts a rook on g-file, coupled with the knight, it would be very unpleasant for white. So white played rook c1 because it was under attack, king h7, vacating the g8 square for the rook, knight d1, white wants to exchange this very strong knight, bishop f6, opening the g file for rooks with tempo, attacking the queen, and also activating the bishop, queen f2, rook g8. At first sight, it seems that it looks like black is losing the second pawn. However, it's not the case, because black easily gets back this pawn. So first white wins the pawn, second pawn, but now bishop g5. Now this bad bishop, which used to be bad, is very active here, as you see. Queen e2, and black decided to exchange this bishop, as black gets a very strong attack and gets his pawns back. So bishop takes, queen takes, and now bishop h3, attacking g2. So in order to avoid the catastrophe on g2, the only move is g3. However, after g3, f3 is weak and it falls. Queen takes f3, so black gets back one of the pawns. However, pawns here aren't important at all. What is important is that black has a total domination on the only open f file. And white cannot play rook f1 in order to fight for the f file, as there is a very strong bishop on h3. So, and all light squares are also weakened. And this bishop isn't doing anything. And besides that, the e4 pawn is weak, so white's position is absolutely lost. Rook c3, queen takes. Now material equality is re-established, and black has a great positional advantage. c5, rook g7. The idea is to prepare doubling on the f file of the rooks. Queen c2, white pins the queen, and now the exchange of queens is inevitable. However, that exchange doesn't ease white's defense. Queen takes, rook f8. Now black threatens to play rook f7 with intolerable pressure on the f file. That's why white played rook f2 in order to exchange a pair of rooks. However, that doesn't ease the defense either. Of course, black doesn't take the rook, as it would let the white king to leave this g1 square and become active. That's why, of course, black played rook f7. White took one rook, and now this position is absolutely lost. If you look at it attentively, you will see that the king, white king, cannot leave the g1 square. Black constantly has a checkmating threats on f1, so the rook cannot leave the first rank. And if we compare the bishops, you will see that white bishop isn't doing anything and is passive, while black bishop is great. Besides that, the d5 pawn is weak, and there is no way white can defend it. So c takes d, c takes d, rook e1, rook f3, so rook penetrates, bishop c1, rook d3, attacking d5, bishop e3, attacking a7, a6, defending it, king f2, rook takes d5. So now black has two connected passed pawns in the center, and there is nothing white can do in order to stop the advance of these pawns. So rook c1, threatening to check and take the pawn on b7. That's why king g6. Now rook c7 comes without check, and black has time to play rook b5, defending the pawn and also attacking on b4. Rook c4, defending it, bishop e6, rook h4, attacking h6, that's why h5, a4, rook d5, h3, bishop d7, attacking a4 and forcing white to play a5. Now bishop would be very active on this diagonal. So rook d3, king e2, bishop b5, threatening the discovered check. And in this position, actually, white resigned, because after king f2, d5, there is no way white can stop the advance of